Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm John Reimer. I represent the Alberta School Boards Association on the Planning Committee for this symposium. And today I'll be acting as the moderator for this panel discussion. The theme of this discussion is perspectives on rural sustainability, depopulation, the challenges, the issues, and the success. And I'd like to thank Michelle Mulder for all the work she did in putting together this panel and doing the groundwork that laid it all out for us. We have a fascinating and lively panel. Some of them you may recognize. Let me introduce them from my immediate left, across the table to the far left. First is Jay Slemp. Jay was born and raised on a family farm in Fleet, Alberta. He completed his high school at Castor and attended Olds College, where he graduated with a diploma in agricultural production. He started working with the Special Areas Board in 1975 and held various positions and postings in Consort, Oyen, and Hanna. He was later appointed chairman of the Special Areas Board in 1991, and he held that position until this past January when he retired. So he's not flitting around the globe like I often do when I since I've retired, and he's here with us today. Greatly appreciate your presence, Jay. During his 40 years in special areas, he's had a keen interest in finding community solutions for community issues. And with the support of the Advisory Council, he was an active leader in a project in Oyen, Cereal, Acadia Valley, and Empress, aimed at mobilizing these communities to work together to overcome some of the issues they had with declining population and changing farm structures. Return to Rural has been expanded into the Consort, Veteran, and Ontario areas. Jay's also been actively involved in investigating the feasibility of Special Areas water supply project, and it's a large-scale plan to divert water into special areas as a foundation for rural development. He's been an active member of the Shirley-McClellan Regional Water Commission, and this large-scale project has brought water successfully to a large part of East Central Alberta. Jay believes strongly in building strong partnerships, in finding regional solutions, and building needed infrastructure in remote and rural areas, as opposed to centralizing everything. Seated next to Jay is Iris Evans, and many of you probably know Iris from her many years of service in the province. Iris takes great pride in her public service as both an elected school trustee, a councillor, and subsequently a provincial politician, and has served collectively for many, many years. So I'll say 33, but it's been a long time and probably more than these 33. She's held positions as chairman of both the Strathcona Public School Board and the local hospital board. She's served as president of the Alberta School Trustees Association, which is now the ASBA. She has served as a reeve in municipal government in Strathcona County. She's held 6 cabinet positions during her time as a provincial politician. And currently, Iris is president of You First Incorporated and draws on her wealth of political experiences, her wealth of life experience to provide management advice, designing winning strategies for various corporate groups, and has been actively engaged in speaking engagements in Ireland and across Alberta. Recently, Iris graduated as valedictorian from the ICD program for board directors, and she was originally educated as a music teacher, correct? Yeah. And registered nurse, and of course, enjoys family gatherings, gardening, and traveling. Seated next to Iris is Lars Holstrom. Dr. Holstrom is director of the Alberta Centre for Sustainable Rural Communities at the University of Alberta, and is a professor in 2 of the departments, social science at Augustana, as well as resource economics and environmental sociology. His work focuses on comparative public policy, particularly on the intersection of politics, science, public policy in fields such as environmental, social, and health policy. He's been the recipient of over 80 research and knowledge mobilization grants and is published widely on issues in rural development, rural governance, municipal and local policy making, environmental policy, natural resource management, and civic activism. He's particularly interested in the design and the evaluation of multi-level programs and interventions to support the adaptation and resilience in a complex system such as rural communities, and in the role of public and expert knowledge in decision-making conditions of high risk and a high uncertainty. He sits on the board of Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation and is also team lead and steering committee member for the Rural Policy Learning Commons. He's lead editor for 2 edited volumes that will be available later in 2015, Ecosystems, Society and Health, Pathways Through Diversity, Convergence and Integration. This is being produced by McGill and Queen's University Press. And the second volume is Sustainability Planning and Collaboration in Rural Canada, available through University of Alberta Press. Seated next to Lars is Leanne Kirchessen, and she's the group lead of community investment for Cenovus Energy. As group lead, she works to develop partnerships and help build a strong and prosperous future for local communities in Cenovus's operating communities in Alberta and Saskatchewan. She also manages their community strategies and investments with their Calgary, their military safety and emergency and social services partners. She has over 10 years of experience in the oil and gas industry, in community affairs, community relations, public relations, and event planning. Leanne also spent 8 years working and volunteering in the nonprofit sector for the Canadian Breast Cancer Foundation, for Alberta Northwest Territories chapter, and as a senior manager for community partnerships, she managed the CIBC Run for the Cure in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, as well as other community events and partnerships. She has a marketing and business administration diploma from Mount Royal College, and she has earned Community Involvement Leadership Academy certificate from Boston College, Carroll School of Management. Born and raised in Calgary, she's married to a Calgary police officer, and they have 2 very active young boys of 4 and 7, and she's frequently volunteering in her schools. Al Canmore was recently elected to his first term of the AAMDC board as a director of District 2 back in the fall of 2010. He is speaking to us in part from his experience in municipal government. He was elected councillor in Reeve in Mountain View County in 2004 and has been re-elected as councillor for his 4th term in 2013. Al has been involved in numerous committees in the Central Alberta Economic Partnership, and as chair in the Municipal Area Partnership, he's been a founding member. The Mountain View Waste Commission as chair, vice chair of AAMDC, mayor and Reeves Committee, and a member of the Standing Issues Committee on Social Issues, just to name a few of the things he's been involved in. In November of 2014, he was elected for a 2-year term as president of AAMDC. He has a strong background in agriculture with experience running a purebred dairy farm, as well as farming a combination of mixed and custom farming and trucking operations. He and his wife Kathy have raised their 3 children on their farm just north of Olds. Al always takes and has tried to take a leadership approach when it comes to municipal partnerships and collaborations. The committee or the panel was given a series of questions to base their presentations on. They're going to speak for about 5 to 8 minutes each, and then when they're finished, hopefully there'll be some time for you to ask questions. So, welcome to the panel, and Jay, if you'd like to step up and you can start.
Thanks. Great to be here. It's great to be meeting with a group of people who understand rural remote. And when we think about sustainability of communities or rural Alberta, when you look around the room, you see people who understand what it is going to take to be sustainable into the future. When we think about rural, what are we really talking about? If we talk about it at a provincial election point of view, it's urban and rural. There's the people in the cities, and then there's the rural people. That's the rest of us. And not negatively. There's the two groups on one hand, and then on the other. But that's not really quite an accurate enough or a fine enough point to put on to rural. Rural has to have a little finer point because there is an area right around the city that is urban. It's almost urban in its context, and its diversity. It's a diversified economy, and their farming population is declining. Ours is too, but theirs is being overcome by people who are seeking jobs in the city and diversifying their economy. If we move out further, just a little bit further out, there's another ring, and it's kind of the what we would call kind of the Drumheller, Stettler. They're kind of out there. They're maybe just on the past an hour commute, and so once you get out past an hour commute, there's another group of another ring around our major centers that are what I would call gateway. They're really service centers, and they're doing just fine. They're growing at a little slower rate, and their economy is a little bit less diversified. But it is still growing, and it's not reliant on just one or two industries or primary industries. And then as we move outside of those areas, as we get out past an hour and a half from our major centers, we have what I would call rural remote, and that rural remote area has a whole thing. It's characterized by maybe a declining population. It's characterized by having not a very diversified economy. Mostly primary. People are there for primary production, primary oil production, primary gas. It's all resource based and subject to the whim and the price fluctuations of those commodities. We've known that all along. We've been going through that for as long as Alberta has existed. And so if we're thinking about sustainability, when we talk about rural and urban, we have to remember that what we need to articulate, and I'm thinking that we're speaking to people from rural remote here mostly, we have to articulate that when you make a policy for rural Alberta, it has to take into account the fact that you just can't make one rural policy. One size does not fit all. And it's our job really to articulate that and to try and articulate to people, and that's really the purpose of this conference, and good for you for doing it, because that's what has to be articulated. And so when you have the minister down or you have people come out, they have to come out and see that there's a difference there, and that those policies have to change. Small schools by necessity is an example of that change. It isn't about economics. It costs more to do business in rural, remote Alberta, point blank. And so we have to remember that. And so we need to make sure that we're articulating that. I'm kind of upset that they took the planes away from the ministers. I mean, I want them to fly around. They're busy. I want them to fly to my community. And just because someone maybe wasn't as judicious as they could be isn't a reason to take it away. And so I'm hoping that we can articulate to them that we want you to fly to our community, and when you get there, we're not going to complain about the cost of the plane, because we want you to come out. And if I can drive across the city and just meet with you, that's different than us having to go to 3 or 4 hours. They're busy and we need to do that. And maybe we have to use some of the technology to connect with them as well, and maybe they don't have to fly, but there's certainly nothing like you coming to our community and seeing what we're doing. As we go through these communities and we think about, if you think of Alberta as if you put a blanket across Alberta and you dropped a big bowling ball at Edmonton and a big bowling ball in Calgary, and you see that blanket sag there, and then there's smaller ones in some of the service centers, Camrose and Grand Prairie and Lethbridge, Medicine Hat, great places. As that grows and that bowling ball gets bigger, you can start to see that the resources all, it's kind of like when the big kid jumps in the bed beside you, and you roll over there. Well, that's what's really happening in some ways, isn't it? The economies are growing in these diversified economies, and then all of these resources start to roll in there. And we're feeling, we're really starting to feel in rural remote Alberta that we're on the 7-degree slope. We're starting to lean, and the cities are in there feeling this is all coming towards me, and so we have to figure out a way. I think in some ways we have to think if we're going to be sustainable, we have to think about a way of maybe balancing the economic growth within the province. Maybe we have to become more diversified in rural Alberta, and we have to think about that and be intentional about doing that. So I think that's really a key thing that we have to kind of remember. I think one of the things we know is that when we think about sustainability, we think it's about money. And remember that as budgets get tight, we operate from a triple bottom line of economic, social, and environmental. When budgets get tight, economic takes the priority. And we have to remember it's going to become a priority issue. We have the disadvantage of being more costly in the things we do cost more. We have to travel, we have to do all of those things. And so we have to figure out ways to overcome that. But we have to make sure that the message is there, is that it is not all about economics. And a large part of what you're talking about here is the social side. Yeah, it's cost a lot of money, but you know what, when you put a kid on the bus for 50, a grade 1 kid on the bus for 50 miles, when you close the school, that's a social implication. It's not all about money. It is about having advantages for all the people in Alberta. And so we need to articulate that, and we have to make sure and be prepared. Believe it or not, the government is not the enemy. We are the government. Don't ever forget that. It's not them, it's us. We are the government. And so we need to make sure that we have a clear voice and a clear purpose and a unified voice going forward. The interesting thing is, as money gets short, you're going to have that same argument at your school board table. You're going to have that same argument in your school about when money gets short, you're going to have that argument. Be prepared for it. And really, at the end of the day, you have to go in there. And I think we're at the most, when money gets short, we actually get into exciting times. It's exciting. Why? Because we have to innovate. We have to prioritize. And you know what? We get rid of some stuff we don't need. We cut some stuff out that we actually thought we needed, but really didn't. Are we going to be sustainable? Of course we're going to be sustainable. Those that are successful are not necessarily the fittest, the people with the resources or the energy. It's the people who are going to be able to adapt. And so the people who survived are the adapters. You know, the guy that went out there, you think of caveman out there, it wasn't the guy that had the big, strong club. It was the guy that had the big, strong mind that won. And so I think what we have to do is remember, I'm going to be ready to adapt. Is it going to be the same? No. It's not the same as it was 10 years ago, and we've had probably 10 of the best years of our lives. We've been able to do some things. You're going to find out, and I believe that you will be very successful because I know who you are. I know where you come from. I know the leadership that you provide. And so I want to encourage you. I want to let you know that it's going to be okay. Is it going to be the same? No, but you're going to be successful, and we are going to be successful. I love the idea. It's about leadership, and you have keen people here. It's about leadership. Where are we leading? We are going to step up, and we're going to see some tremendous leaders developed, and you are going to give your kids the best education that they will ever get, because the best educations are caught, they're not taught. And you are going to be an example of how we're going to adapt in hard times. Nothing wrong with that. It is the key to success, and I want to encourage you. Thank you for today, and I'll let some of the others speak.
Well, I could have just listened to Dean and now to Jay, because I could say ditto with a lot of what they've said and then just sit down if I was, well, it's not my mother's daughter and just love to talk. I'm so sorry for that. When the water dries up, the animals look at each other differently. It's another way of saying it. But I just can't resist saying this. Every woman knows that one size does not fit all in pantyhose. And if any of you guys have worn them, you'd understand that as well. So let's just put that there. I'm believing in giving you some tools before you leave, because a lot of what I learned in politics was learned at the table of the minor hockey executive. And believe me, if you want to have a cutthroat business, it's right there, right? Somebody here is laughing. He's still got the scars. But I'm going to talk to you about relationships, I'm going to talk to you about time, and I'm going to talk to you about love. And if you haven't met everybody in this room, by the time you're finished having your lunch, at least meet one person that you consider a stranger to yourself. And it'll help you practice when you go back into your community and meet and network with the people that you have to know to be successful. You see, we're only part of the team here. We've got our municipal counterparts. How about the ag service boards that are just dying on the vine? They are dying because a lot of the arenas are closing, so they can't run their gymkhana. And everybody has become so tight with the money, they thought in the last 10 years, they're kind of squirreling it away. It's now ours. It's not theirs and ours. So we've got to do some really deep soul searching for sharing. And that's when tough times make real winners out of people. And you're here because you want to know from me a little bit about how you get along with a minister. Never forget, when a minister walks into that office, there might be a mousetrap, there might be a paperclip and crumbs of whoever left it. You are the minister's educators. You see, the premier's on top and he appoints that minister, but he also supervises the appointment of the deputies. And he also supervises the Chief of Staff, Mike Percy, and the appointment of the people that serve the needs of the minister. No, not the minister. It's really the ministry. It's the mission of the ministry. And so take it upon yourself to become educators. And oh my goodness, I was just talking to Al, you better keep that orientation book handy, because we've changed way too often for you to get comfortable that you know the person at the top. So you can get to know the person at the top, but if you don't know the person you live with, you're not going to figure out how to work that relationship. You know, I was really blessed to be a school board chairman in a small jurisdiction. Strathcona was smaller then. It was a county system. And the county fathers and mothers dealing with the schools, the county reeve, which I ultimately became, managed the corporate affairs of the common interest theme. So we had corporate meetings once a month. The county meeting dealt with everything that was joined and not separate, like our computer systems, like how the bus routes worked. And that system may have been trashed, but that idea of working with the municipal fathers on everything is really important. You've just been reminded the MGA is going to have a huge effect on you. If you don't know what that means, you better get used to it. As a matter of fact, what I loved about the MGA was at least you had all the natural person powers that somehow they forgot to give trustees. And I know sometimes at meetings you felt like children of lesser gods, because they'll remember to introduce every councillor in the territory, but they never remember the trustees. And God forbid they remember the school council members. You know what you do? You take your paper up to the front and say, oh, we're here today. Here's when you introduce people, here's our names. You're damn well, do it. Get bold, right? I had some messages for you. Don't shoot the wagons or circle the wagons and shoot inward. And don't expect Prince Charming to come up on a horse with a lottery bag full of money. It isn't going to happen, even less now. If you own the business, what would you cut and where would you collaborate? Inclusivity, for God's sake. Don't see people as different groups. They are all, if they live or in your territory or passing through, they're yours. They're yours no matter what their color, their creed, their sexual preference is. They are ours. They're Albertans, and celebrate that diversity. We're a Canadian mosaic. We're not a melting point. We're not a melting pot, rather, like the American system of governance really is. We have to respect that we're not all going to think the same and wear the same clothes. And that's a great way in rural Alberta to make people feel welcome. And render to Caesar that which is Caesar. But don't pretend that you're going to be everything to all people. It's teamwork that builds. I loved in Texas the idea of a chicken supper where all the leaders got together. And then it expanded the leadership, and ultimately everybody knew what the plan is. When you build those relationships, you go home and you have a planning meeting with everybody in the room. Church ministers and so on. When I was raised in Staveley, Alberta, yes, we had a candidate for social welfare, and if you hunted and got a deer, you gave them steaks. You gave them whatever you could afford. We didn't have a social service network then, but we've built that. I wanted to talk a little bit about time. I remember one day trying to start a parent cooperative kindergarten and being on the phone and telling my child, shh, mommy's doing important work. Really easy to do when you're doing this kind of work in the public. Take time for your family and take time to touch on those roots that are important to you and your best friends. Believe me, when I'm out of government, as I am now after 33 and a quarter years, they don't call up and ask me for my opinion anymore on the Hill, but my family still need me. So don't forget that. That's nourishing yourself. It's really important that you take home in your notes 2 words, mental health. That applies to you as well as everybody else. And I can't believe the atrocities in the world are being done by people that have great mental health. Somewhere along the line, something twisted them. Make sure that people that leave your community don't remain or aren't twisted. And you really have to love. In Staveley, Alberta, they named the school after my dad, the A.J. Nowicki School. He was a school principal, and I adored him. I walked to school every day, jumping from footprint to footprint to footprint in the snow to follow him to school, and I wanted to be just like him one day, because to me, he epitomized a mountain of a man that loved children, which is exactly what was important, to be passionate about education, love children. And when he died, they named the school after A.J. Nowicki, and the people from Staveley asked me, because I was then a minister of children's services, they're going to close the school named after your dad. What do you think? And I thought of what my dad would say, and this is what my dad would have said. If it's better and in the best interest of the child, do it. So sometimes you're going to close schools and it's going to be uncomfortable and some legacy will be gone. That legacy will seem to evaporate in the wind, but it will remain and the strands will be picked up. It's not about buildings. It's about the heroes of the individuals that look after those people that are in those buildings. So if you can't figure out what to do with your surplus infrastructure because it was built and it's no longer useful, kind of cast your mind to the wind and remember that people are closing travel agencies one by one, 2 by 2, and also remember that sometimes you curse the internet and that mobile app, but that's a way of remaining connected with the rest of the planet, and thank God for it, or else half the time my sons and their families and I would have been so distant and so separated. Cherish that, and one final little idea. There are about 50 honorary consuls in Alberta that represent governments that we don't know. And if you think you've got a settlement in your community that could network with that community in Germany and Switzerland and Holland and Sudan, whatever it is, wherever it's at, think about the fact that you might just be Mecca for those people and you can figure out a whole new path to sustainability. God bless you. I love you. Michelle and Helen, thank you. You're doing yeoman's work. And when you folks applaud at the end of the day, remember, super leadership. Thanks again.
So that's a tough act to follow. We didn't have a plan coming into this, so this was not by design, although I'm now starting to wonder if I wasn't set up. It would not be the first time. Thank you again to Michelle and the organizers and to all of you for coming and for still being here, right? There's always, you think, lunch, car, weather, I could be home in 3 hours, I could pick up the kids. So thank you all for being here. And also thank you to the previous speakers for giving me something to steal. What I want to talk about for a few minutes here is a little bit of synthesis and my perspective on some of the content that I've heard here and trying to situate that into a broader context of rural development, rural sustainability, rural public policy, broadly defined. Again, we don't really have a rural policy. We don't really have a lot of policy action in terms of rural development right now for many different reasons. And to situate the question of education and schools within a broader systems perspective on sustainability for rural communities. So some big picture, big pattern stuff, to quote my friend Cheryl Bartlett. And I want, hopefully, for you to leave today thinking about causes. Not in terms of what are the causes, but how causality works. To think about education, to think about your roles as teachers, as trustees, as principals, as stewards of education in this province, and to think about the causes and effects of what you do, what you want to do, how you do it, and how these ripple out throughout our communities, and also how our communities include our educational institutions, and I include universities and colleges within this as well. So I'm going to give you two words, and these are proximal and distal causation. So you get a little terminology lesson there. You can take it back to your classes or your boards. This event has, and it makes sense, has really focused on what we call a lot of the proximal questions. How do we get kids into schools? How do we keep kids in schools? How do we ensure that the programming that we offer, that our curricula are appropriate, are working? How do we assess these things? So it's very much a question of how does X affect Y. But what happens when we step back from this a little bit? When we step back from how do we solve the immediate problems of today, and let's remember too, school closures, not new. Getting teachers in rural communities, not new. Keeping teachers in rural communities, not new. As a child, I read the books of Laura Ingalls Wilder, right? 100+ years ago in Mankato, I think. Difficulty getting teachers, right? These are not new patterns. We are replicating and struggling with the same dynamics over and over and over again. Some of you might know what the definition of doing the same thing over and over again but expecting different results is. I'm not going to diagnose you. I'm not qualified to do that. But it raises some very real questions, because if we continue to struggle with the same dynamics over and over and over again, maybe we're not pitching at the right plate. Maybe we're not targeting our actions, our causes, and our effects in the right way. This doesn't mean that we're doing things wrong. Maybe we do need to think differently about the systems within which we work, about the policies that we put into place, about the structures, about how we think about causation, in order to step back and to have a, not just big picture, a big pattern perspective on the challenges, on the problems that exist. We all know that there are demographic issues, that depopulation is an issue. Again, not new. We know that rural communities in Alberta are disproportionately aging and aged, right? Again, not new. So what are some of the other things that we know? We know that there are socioeconomic and sociodemographic social patterns that complicate the role of schools. How many of you are teachers or have taught? How many of you have ever told your best student in a graduating class in a rural community that you need to stay here and never leave? Anybody going to volunteer for that one? No volunteers? Unless you marry her, yes. Thanks, Dean. Yes, there's always that option. Not for everybody. We know that there are broader social dynamics, and whether we want to be, and I'm guilty of this as well, when I have undergraduates who are exceptional students at Augustana, again, we don't have graduate programming there, the best we can hope for in some ways is that they'll maybe go to Edmonton and stay somewhat close, but in many cases we have students who are looking at Cambridge, at Oxford, the University of Toronto, UBC, right? So even at that level, they're looking to move on. But what we can do is talk with them and work with them about how they may return. And I've heard many assumptions over the last 2 days about the return to rural. And I encourage you to think about the dynamics and the pattern and the role of schools in that return to rural. It's not automatic. Just because you have a great community, just because you have great people, does not mean they will always come back. And just because you have great jobs does not mean that students will always come back. We need to think about the bigger patterns in particular about not just recruitment, but retention. If you build it, they may come, but they may not stay. So we need to think about the role of education and of schools in the context of innovation, in the context of resilience. And as my two preceding speakers pointed out, we need to think about how we can adapt. And while jobs and economic development are critical, economic development is not synonymous with rural development or sustainability. In times of fiscal and financial crisis, yes, we get obsessed with the dollars. I am. Everybody at every post-secondary institution, and probably anybody who gets a budget from anybody in government, is waiting, right? Every day you check your email thinking, oh God, maybe today's the day. How bad or how good is it going to be? We do become a little OCD about these things. I may have some spreadsheets. I'm willing to share, do some forecasting. What happens when we actually think about community first? Bertolt Brecht, the playwright, had a great quote which I use often, which is bread first, then politics. And people often assume that this means, well, you need money to buy the bread. But if we unpack this a little bit, the source of bread is community. It is the relationships, it is the connections, it is the interpersonal and interorganizational dynamics that allow economic development to happen. Markets are relationships. Markets do not exist out there, despite what some economists would like us to believe. Markets exist here. Markets exist between people, between organizations, between communities. And it's somewhat ironic because as we worry about deficits, as we worry about sustainability, as we worry about resilience, we actually know that here in Alberta, if you look at the sustainability plans of rural communities across the province, and we've done this, so I get to say this, most rural communities actually don't want economic considerations to be first. Their planning does not represent that. Social and environmental considerations are equal or of greater importance. Put the community first. Let the relationships first. Let what we often think of as the pleasant byproducts of education and of schools become first. Al Lawson mentioned this yesterday. If we think about the assets in a community, and if we view schools as assets, not just in terms of infrastructure, teaching, curricular hours, contact hours, but if we think about the role that schools play within systems, within communities that are also part of larger systems, we start to have a very different perspective on what contributes to a process of community sustainability. And schools and education are key parts of this. If we look at what is called a community capitals framework, human capital, knowledge, is important, but it's one of 7 or 9 different types of capital, right? Human capital is the idea that we can be more productive. This was the original definition of human capital. If you have a tool, you are more efficient. You're a better producer. You're a better economic unit. This is important. But there are lots of other elements. There are 9 other things that many, many communities now understand, and this may include your communities. I do encourage you to look at your community sustainability plans. See where education factors into this. See where education fits into the long-term perspective on your communities, your municipalities. And think beyond human capital. Think about the role for social capital, for innovation. If your communities are resistant to ideas from outside, which can happen, they will find it hard to innovate. If you cannot innovate, if you cannot adapt, you will struggle. We don't have to be Darwinian, but there are certain dynamics there that resonate. The social networks that emerge from schools, the connections that emerge, and that we see some of the programming that's happening here between businesses, between schools, and between the not-for-profit sector, where people are brokering these relationships. These things work, not because they're creating jobs, because they're creating relationships. They're moving beyond human capital. They're building capacity. And that capacity is a mechanism that we can never achieve sustainability. Sustainability is not an end point. You'll never have a community can say, that one is sustainable. Because as soon as you say that, they're dead. Because you cease to innovate. You cease to adapt. You think that's it, c'est fait accompli, we're good. Instead, we need to think about how we in rural communities, whether it's rural development, economic development officers, educators, administrators, elected officials, citizens at large, the nonprofit sector, all have to think about how do we work collectively? How do we think collectively in order to integrate and understand that we are trying to build not just human capital and not just social capital, but 7 different types of capital that support community sustainability. And when you start to think about those big patterns, you can start to see your role, and you may not see a path forward, but you may see a light that shows the way to a path forward. Thank you very much.
Well, I am going to say as well, those are some really tough people to follow, and my expertise are not even close to that. I'm definitely on the softer side and the community investment side. So I'm going to talk about that interaction, and specifically from a Synovus energy and different energy organizations contributing back to rural communities. So as someone that has worked and lived and traveled extensively throughout rural Alberta and Saskatchewan, we actually play a game in our office all the time about give me a city that I haven't been to or can't name and don't know exactly where it is in Alberta. So I have traveled extensively throughout Alberta and Saskatchewan. So for companies such as Synovus, we share the same challenges about local workforce and community services. Synovus and its employees understand rural reality because we live and work near and more than 100 rural communities in Alberta and Saskatchewan, all the way from Fort Chipewyan, Cold Lake, Lac La Biche, Wabasca, Brooks, Drumheller, Bassano, Weyburn, and Tilley. In the area that I work in specifically, we receive thousands of requests yearly for many different capital projects, such as playgrounds, arenas, community halls that obviously help maintain that social fabric for these rural communities. So I spend a lot of time, everybody asks me, you have such a great job, and I'm very passionate about my job. We work in community investment and we give money back to organizations, nonprofits, communities, organizations. I spend a lot of time not only giving money, we also obviously do a lot of declines, but the other piece of it is I spend a lot of time building relationships. We were talking earlier about my time with Reeves and council members and different aldermen and MLAs and so on, really finding out what are the needs of the communities and how do we help make it sustainable, because we live and work and obviously want to make the future bright in those communities. So I definitely have the integrate into the community relation aspect of that. We also fund requests from schools, emergency services, and social services programs. We talked earlier about, one of my presentations is that about emergency services. Majority of our whole province in Alberta is run by volunteer fire departments. Any rural roads that you travel on, if somebody was coming to help you at a time that you're in need, they are usually a volunteer. And so we invest heavily into volunteer emergency services, and that helps make sustainable communities in many ways. A lot of those volunteer firemen and women are employees of our organization. So not only do they work and do operations for Synovus, they also volunteer in many ways, not only for fire departments, as you were saying, hockey, 4-H clubs, and so on. So we take great pride in investing in our employees and have a very large capacity dollar for doers program as well to contribute back. So those volunteers can contribute back to the organizations that they're participating in. We want these communities to be better off because we're there. With this in mind, Synovus has made learning one of its 3 main areas of focus through our community investment program. So obviously, with this education symposium, that is one of the key pieces. Our goal to work with organizations and program and help bolster learning experiences from early education through post-secondary years and beyond. Synovus believes that by fostering and promoting collaboration and partnerships, that supporting rural schools and their communities, we can help ensure students' future success and the community sustainability. I guess one example that comes to mind is I met with the village of Tilly, and they were trying to keep their school going and keeping the kids engaged. So they decided to add a 4-H club element into the curriculum, and we funded that. And to this day, as of, they are still viable. I know Ardmore School up north as well has the same program. Obviously, some of the schools have hockey academies and baseball academies, and we help fund to make those schools a little more viable, to keep schools engaged, or kids engaged into those schools. Synovus will support maybe cash or in kind, as I was saying, by volunteer aspects, all the way from computers to office equipment and so on. We have a huge K-12 program and invest in many outreach programs to go out to the communities as well. One of the biggest things that we get requests for are obviously building renovations and new buildings. And we were even chatting earlier today about that. There's such a big cost to that, and I think one of my jobs is expectation management. We actually call that as our other title, as meeting expectations. The more innovative, which I think all of us have used that word, and unique, and we can be with coming together to coming up with sustainable plans. That's something a corporation will look at very, very easily. I know one of the questions that I probably will get asked is about the market these days in the energy sector. Obviously, we're going through a very unique situation, and it's obviously a cycle, but it definitely has caused a lot of commotion, and it'll be interesting times. You just don't know when the beginning or the end, and there's a lot of unknown, as we were just chatting about. So it'll be interesting to see what transpires. But from our standpoint, we live and work in rural communities, and we're there to stay, and definitely want to help with the future. So I think our goal is to definitely commit, and we're committed to being in those communities. So that is it for now. So thank you. I'll pass it on.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. I'm kind of caught in my own design here, and it hasn't worked out very well, because I thought I'd sit on that end of the table so that I didn't get in the same situation I was last time I was on a panel, where I sat in the first place, and I thought, I should have said that, I should have said that, I should have said that. Now I'm in a situation where, gee, I don't know what to say, because they've said it all. So, but one of the things I did want to talk about before I really get into my little presentation is, you saw Dean Cooper up here earlier, and Dean to me is an example, and I'm not doing this to butter him up, because I had the privilege of being here post-flood. I toured the community with Dean, and our president of AMD&C at that time also toured the community. And there's some little known facts that really go amiss in this whole flood situation. High River and Calgary, they were hit hard. There's no doubt about it. This community was hit probably harder, and I don't think it ever garnered the attention it needed. I believe 98% of their residents were affected so directly that they had to leave their homes or move to another place in this community. The Army couldn't get in, and they rallied together. Like, that is what resilience is all about. Dean asked, what's a Reeve supposed to do? The Reeve is the person who leads the community that way and takes them down the road, and Dean did a fantastic job with that. He identified torpedoes coming down the mountain, and I was able to tour around on the very northwest corner, I guess, of town, and there was a house there that had a tree that big stuck into this house, not through a window, but it went straight through the wall, in through an inside wall, and was ready to stick outside the door, the wall on the other side. That's the power that came down the hills in his community this past 2 years ago. It was profound. And to see the houses in 5 feet of mud and trying to figure out how you're going to deal with that. They work together as a community to do that. And to me, that's what I believe all our rural municipalities have the capacity to do, but it's always so impressive to see it happen when it really does happen. I'm here representing AAMD&C, Alberta Association of Municipal Districts and Counties. And we represent the 69 rural municipalities, so the 69 MDs and counties throughout all Alberta. And in that, we advocate on their behalf to the governments, both federal and provincial. But we also provide business services and bulk buying services to our municipalities, but also probably to a lot of your school boards or to other organizations that are nonprofit based. We are the largest fuel supplier to nonprofits in all of Canada. We are the largest supplier of parts for graders, blades, and tires in all of Western Canada when it deals with nonprofits. So we do that to make sure our members have the best opportunity to shop competitively, and we create a competitive market out there. We have an insurance company that carries both property insurance and liability insurance with pools covering over billions of dollars worth of assets and liability. So it's a bit of an idea who we are. Rural municipalities, Alberta is unique in all of Canada. We are the only province that has municipalities north to south, east to west. Other than a few provincial parks and federal parks, we are the only province that covers all the province with municipal jurisdictions. So it puts it in perspective a little bit. I'm from Mountain View County, and we are, I always like to say, the meat and the sandwich between Calgary and Red Deer. We're right in the middle, right on Highway 2, and we are what I would consider urban. Bordering maybe a little more rural than urban, but we are very heavily urban influenced and not as rural as what we are here in the Bighorn area or what special areas is. Or Mackenzie County, if you ever have a chance to look at a municipal map. Mackenzie County covers that whole northwest corner of the province, and it's massive. They are responsible for the roads within that county, not the province. The province has their highways, but any non-business or non-provincial road is the jurisdiction of the counties, and it is huge. Remote is only a small way of saying the impacts. So I have the opportunity to represent the whole province, and my number one challenge is to keep that in my mind all the time. It's not what it's like in Mountain View County. Remote rural is a bigger item to deal with than I think we all realize. You know, we hear discussion about the shrinking of the rural. And in actual fact, in Alberta since 1986, Alberta's rural municipalities have grown by over 100,000 people. It's interesting, but the problem is we're losing on the percentage of population rate, where we're seeing the urban centers, being the big cities and mid-sized cities, they're growing so profoundly in this area. So we are actually, as much as we are still growing, and we're the only province where rural has grown in the last 20 years, we are still losing in that balance of percentage of population. So that creates dynamics in government and representing our people in government that are changing on a daily basis. One of the reasons that rural, I think, plays such a large part is a report released in 2012 by the Conference Board of Canada. And I always found it intriguing because we've always said that the heart of the economy starts in rural. And we even have a tagline for the election coming up, because you don't see wheat fields in the cities, you don't see oil, or you see very few pump jacks or gas valves in the cities. Lumber does not come out of cities. Tourism, large area tourism, does not come out of the cities. We cover so much of that economy, so much in the fact that the Conference Board of Canada identified $68.1 billion a year of Alberta's economy starts in rural Alberta. And that's a significant number. The other part is we know that increases jobs within our rural communities, but it also leads to the fact, and it's their numbers, not ours. We didn't ask them to pursue the information, it's theirs. 250,000 jobs in the urban centers are based on activity that happens in the rural centers, or in the rural communities. So we need to realize that we have an impact on this province, and I think we need to keep selling that to our government. And Iris is here, and she's former Minister of Municipal Affairs at one point when I first got elected. And she understands these things, but we got to make sure that all of the government understands it. Her and I did have a conversation just before we came up here, and my frustration as an elected official is I've been on AMD&C's board for 5 years, and I've had 5 different municipal affairs ministers. You guys have seen the same thing in education. So just when you're getting to that point of having them understand what rural is about and the role that we play in the province, boom, got to educate a new one. And it creates ongoing challenges. And it's going to sound wrong, but I'm going to say it anyways. You keep changing ministries, you take the power out of the minister and you put the power in the next level down. And I think that's a little scary at the same time. It provides continuity, but it also puts you in a situation where the bureaucrats, apologize for the word, but the bureaucrats end up being in control of the system more than the elected officials should be. And as an elected official, that's frustrating for me. One of the key themes, and I can't go by my speech, believe me, I'm just looking for points because everybody said it all, but from our perspective at AMDNC, we see 3 real key factors in rural sustainability that have been addressed here already, but I'm going to focus on them again anyways. And one is rural schools and the role that rural schools play in both the social and economic aspects. If you have a person who's looking to start up a new startup business, they go to your community, and I'm not just talking counties here, I'm talking small towns too. You go to that community and there is no school, am I going to bring my kids and start there when I know there is no school? The same thing happens with healthcare. When we lose our hospitals or we lose our ability to care for people locally, when they now have to drive 100 miles to get healthcare, it is another pillar that if we lose that, we lose the structure, not only the service, but the structure that those bring to your community, whether it's social, whether it's business drawing in, whether it's sustaining your population, they are important. And the third one I'm going to tie into it is broadband, because broadband, in my view, is the thing that we have not delivered in this province uniformly. I have a unique situation. I live 5 miles north of the most connected community in this province, being the town of Olds, and I don't have broadband. And that is frustrating. I'm a mile off of Highway 2. I don't have broadband. Now, what's wrong with our system? When we have an opportunity here to keep our hospitals and our schools open by providing that level of technology, we can keep our young people saying, well, I can get all this, and I can have access to the outer world, but not if the playing field isn't level. And if we don't, at some point in the near future, start labeling broadband as an essential service, we are going to just see the rapidly dwindling approach of trying to sustain rural. It can provide services into your education system, into your schools, where you can link to the schools who have got all that programming, and the rural school cannot provide that programming because of numbers. Find out ways, and I'm not a technology expert, but I've seen through a project we've done in my community that ability to deliver from the school that has to the schools that don't have, and create it efficiently as long as we can provide the training on the other end so they can handle the technology. It is there, but we need to have that technology out in special areas, out in the areas that are out there. We have the province and the feds are trying to work with it, but it's an ongoing challenge because we don't have the policy that is going to direct the providers to bring it forward in the future. I got family that live in England, and they live in, if there is a rural part of England anymore, they live in rural England. But my brother-in-law tells me in order for them to be able to provide service within that community, they have to guarantee a certain level of service in the rural community that allows them to at least meet a threshold of expectation. Please bear with me a second here, but I guess I'm just going to wrap it up because you guys have been listening to me long enough. But I think what we need to realize, and you guys are all from rural communities because this is your conference, you know that there is a resource in your community and you are elected by those people. Work with those people. Number one challenge as an elected official is to stay engaged with the people that elected you, but work with those people. There are volunteer organizations, there are the Sonovus of the world or the various other community support corporations. Work with them. Find ways that we can keep that social dynamic, that economic dynamic in our small communities. Come up with partnerships. Partnerships are going to be the key. I know we have challenges between our rural MDs and some of our towns, and trying to come up with collaborative efforts. But don't let it stop you. Just keep thinking outside the box, come up with collaborative efforts. Or we are going to be told how it's going to be done in the future, and nobody wants to be told. I think we need to lead the way and take it on a voluntary basis, make it local decision making, but make it in a collaborative basis. And then I believe we will have another step forward in resiliency in our rural communities. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all the panelists. As a classroom teacher, you know it's really, really dangerous to stand between your class and the door when the lunch bell goes. But before we start lunch, does anybody have a question they'd like to ask of the panel? Yes, sir.
I talk too much sometimes, but that's okay. Everybody's mentioned the problems with sustainability in the rural education. What we're looking for is the solutions. And even the minister last night was talking about more problems than solutions. I think what we have to do, and perhaps some of the members of the panel can comment on this, is, as the last speaker spoke about collaboration, we can't think education. This is an education conference, but we can't think that. We have to think education, medical, economic development, and all that kind of stuff. If we're going to sustain our rural towns, our rural schools, and so forth, we have to think large picture if we don't do that. So I'd like some comments on that from the panel, how we can use that collaboration and look at that larger picture. We're looking for solutions.
I'll take a stab at the start. Is this on? Yes. Go home and plan. And I said, gather the leaders in and plan. That is, you know, it's easier said than done, but you're here with mostly school people. There may be the odd one that has business experience and is primarily focused on business, but you have to get together with other decision makers. I mentioned ag service boards. If you could get your whole community in a hall and list what are our advantages and what are our disadvantages, and if you'd really listen, you might come up with some new ideas for your community. I mean, seriously, nothing stops school trustees from going out and chartering their own better future by thinking through what they could do. And we went out and did planning when we were looking at curriculum change. And later on, that planning, although it didn't seem to be useful right away, enabled us to argue that the creationist theory was the one theory, but didn't necessarily have to be taught in the science curriculum in the schools. The schools don't have to do everything, but they do have to link with other people to plan. The other thing that I think is, it's very hard because somebody mentioned it at a table this morning. I don't know if it was with Peter or somebody else here, but we talked about sometimes you get so involved meeting for meeting's sake. Take a look at your agendas and get those agendas focused on what's really real and make that real stuff happening. I mean, you can look at yourselves first, and like I say, don't expect someone else. The other thing is, don't expect your neighbor to start taking over your service level delivery. Those guys that want to do the snow plowing in your community don't want any forced marriages. So don't look at them to start taking over your mandate or some of that delivery. You can work with them, collaborate with them, but don't expect Al's people to ride in on their graders and be happy to look after your school grounds because it's a nice work of art for them to do. They're struggling too. So I think you said it really well. Two neighborhoods can cooperate, but they don't necessarily have to be joined at the hip and become one government. You know, we had a specialized municipality in Strathcona that worked really well from a government grant perspective, but we're still in the 23 that are clustered around Edmonton, for God's sake, are still trying to work on how they work with each other. And that's an interesting dimension. So I think you've got the expertise here to figure out the solutions. I think you just have to go home and listen and see whether you can get everybody else at the table thinking the same way you do when you leave this conference.
So if I could just add to that two things. One is, the first thing is we draw lines around our municipalities. I've got a county and I've got one village and 4 towns in the county, but you know, nobody ever tripped over that line when they were walking across it. And we got to remember that that line is there for jurisdictional purposes, but it doesn't mean everything stops at that line. It means that's just where the conversation has to be joined. Second comment is we drew a line in this province in mid-90s. We separated the counties from the school boards. We created school boards over here, we created counties over here. They used to all be one, and you had collaboration happening just because that's the way it had to be. I think it was done for the right reasons, but one of the unintended consequences is the fact that even in my association, when we have resolutions come forward, if it's education-based, it's the first comment that comes up. It's education, it's going to undo with us. And I think that's wrong. I think what we need to do, and even, my county, I'm part of the Chinook's Edge, and I've got kids that work, they're teachers, 2 teachers in Chinook's Edge. But we just don't have enough meetings between my county council and the Chinook's Edge School Division, or all the councils in Chinook's Edge. We just don't do it. I'm not blaming my county, I'm not blaming Chinook's Edge, I'm blaming the fact that we just don't do it. And if we want to grow together, if we want to develop together, let's start changing that model, because if we don't, we are going to stay on islands, and being on islands, one person usually gets hungry after a while.
I would add one little piece here. We have to learn how to collaborate. It's not natural. There's a little book out there, it's called Collaborate or Die. Get that book and read it. And it talks about the fact that the barrier to collaboration is two points to it. One is conflict. Is conflict, do we have high conflict or low conflict? Or do we have high confusion or low confusion? Is it the guy just doesn't get it, or that he just doesn't like me? And so I think if we actually go in there, if you put those on a chart, if you went into each one, if it's high confusion and low conflict, then just research and start getting more information. So we want to educate and we want to research. If we have high conflict and high confusion, you better be ready to pit in, because you ain't going to get anything done for a while. You have to deal with both confusion and conflict. If you go down in there, if you have on the other side, if you have kind of like low confusion, everybody understands the deal, but it's just conflict, start to negotiate. So you have to have a negotiation strategy. And then if it's low conflict and low confusion, get moving. But remember, what you have to do is go into each situation and figure out, what am I managing? What am I managing in the relationship? Am I managing confusion? Am I managing conflict? And learn that if you want to be the leader, you can figure out very quickly which one of those to do. And I think that helps us collaborate. We need to learn how to collaborate. The same thing. It's not automatic. And we keep applying the research strategy when we should be negotiating, and we're applying the wrong strategy. And so I think we need to make sure that applies to your school councils, it applies to a number of things of what you need to be doing, and I think that helps. It will help us collaborate better. And it's a skill, learn it.
Does anybody else have a question? Oh, sorry, Lars.
Sorry.
So in terms of solutions too, collaboration is great. Part of my mandate at the university is to collaborate. You have to ask the question, why? Why are we collaborating? It is a policy tool. It's in the Rural Economic Development Action Plan, item 5.1. Please don't ask me why I know that. It's there, right? Regional collaboration for economic development along with affiliated benefits. This is an instrument that can be used by governments and other bodies for all kinds of different purposes, right? Think about why you should, will, and when you can collaborate. And in order to collaborate effectively, you have to know what you bring to the table. Think about your assets. Do some asset mapping. If you want solutions, start with finding out what you have. There are lots of tools available to do asset mapping. There are lots actually of faculty, and actually they make good school projects too, right? There are ways to move this into curriculum. Look at what you have. Look not just at the problems, but look at the assets that you can bring to the table for collaboration. You may find in many communities have found they have resources that have been very beneficial that they were not even conceptualizing as resources not that long ago. But until you go through that very deliberate process, you're kind of just spinning your wheels and hoping you arrive at a positive or a somewhat optimal outcome.
Any other questions? Alrighty. We are here because we live, work, and love rural Alberta. And one thing that I've come to realize over time is that rural Alberta is complex. There is no one single solution. You can't expect any single government to come up with all the solutions, all the answers that are going to fit everyone everywhere. Urbanization is a global problem. Tomorrow, my wife and I are flying off to India to work in rural India for a month. And a lot of the problems that they have in rural India are exactly the same problems we have here. There, they compound it by having huge populations as well. There are commonalities between each of us in our rural areas, but there are also unique differences. And I think that the panel's done an excellent job of pointing out that adaptation, innovation, particularly communication, are some of the tools that we need to put into place. So with that, I'd like to thank the the panel members again for their contributions, and thank you all for staying to participate with us.